In the early hours of June 6, 1944, German observers along the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy heard the distant rumble of aircraft engines. At approximately 15 minutes past midnight, small teams of American pathfinders began dropping from the night sky, their mission to mark drop zones for the largest airborne assault in history. What the Germans did not yet understand was that these first paratroopers belonged to a division that would haunt them across 3 brutal campaigns, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen forests around Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, would become one of the most feared American units the Wehrmacht ever faced, and the evidence for this comes not from American propaganda, but from German military reports, officer memoirs, and the frustrated accounts of soldiers who fought against them and lost. The story of why the Germans came to dread this particular division begins with understanding what made it different from every other unit in the American Army. When Major General William C. Lee activated the 101st Airborne Division on August 16, 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, he issued General Order No. 5, containing words that would define the unit's identity. The 101st Airborne Division has no history, he declared, but it has a rendezvous with destiny. These words were not mere rhetoric. They captured the essential character of a unit that was being built from scratch with the most demanding selection standards in the American military. Every man who wore the Screaming Eagle patch was a volunteer, and not just any volunteer. To earn the right to wear parachute wings, a soldier had first volunteered for the army itself, then volunteered for the grueling parachute training program, and then survived a physical conditioning regimen designed specifically to break anyone who was not genuinely exceptional. At Camp Toccoa, Georgia, the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment ran Currahee Mountain, 3 miles up and 3 miles down, with over 1,700 feet of elevation gain, and anyone who fell out was immediately transferred to regular infantry. The name Currahee came from a Cherokee word meaning stands alone, and the mountain lived up to its name. The regiment ran it repeatedly, in full gear, in all weather conditions, and the men who could not keep up simply disappeared from the unit. The washout rate was staggering. Roughly 2/3 of all volunteers failed to complete the training program. The physical demands alone eliminated many candidates. The runs, the forced marches, the obstacle courses, the endless repetitions of parachute landing falls, all took their toll. But the physical training was only part of it. The psychological pressure was equally intense. Instructors deliberately created stress to identify men who might crack under combat conditions. Sleep deprivation, verbal abuse, impossible deadlines, humiliating punishments for minor infractions. All of it was designed to break anyone whose commitment was less than absolute. Men who complained were gone. Men who quit were gone. Men who could not work as part of a team were gone. The ones who remained were the ones who simply refused to break, no matter what the instructors threw at them. Those who survived the training emerged as something qualitatively different from regular infantrymen. The division was built to be approximately half the size of a standard infantry division, roughly 8,400 men compared to over 14,000 in a conventional unit, but the individual quality of each soldier was intended to compensate for the smaller numbers. Paratroopers earned an additional $50 per month in hazardous duty pay, which was considerable money in 1943, but the real attraction was the prestige and the challenge. The men who passed the training knew they were among the elite. This self-selection produced soldiers with a fundamentally different psychology from regular infantrymen. Paratroopers trained to jump into darkness behind enemy lines without any guarantee of support. They trained to fight without armor or heavy artillery, carrying only what they could jump with. They trained to hold their positions until conventional forces arrived, or until they were dead. Being surrounded was not a crisis to these men. It was the job description. From day one of their training, they were taught that they would always be outnumbered, always be outgunned, and always be cut off from supply lines. Their entire doctrine assumed encirclement as the baseline condition. The tactical consequences of this mentality were profound. Every man was trained to fight independently in small ad hoc groups. Unlike conventional infantry units that relied on clear chains of command and established battle plans, paratroopers were expected to seize initiative without waiting for orders and operate effectively in the confusion that inevitably followed scattered parachute drops. A sergeant might find himself leading men from 3 different companies toward an objective that none of them had originally been assigned. This required a different kind of soldier, one who could think for himself, make decisions under fire, and lead without formal authority. This was precisely the kind of enemy that German commanders found most difficult to predict and counter. The first German officer to truly grasp what was happening on D-Day was Major Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydt, a 37-year-old career officer commanding Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 at Carentan. Von der Heydt was no ordinary officer. He held a doctorate in law, had studied in the United States before the war, and commanded one of the most experienced parachute infantry regiments in the German army. His men were themselves elite soldiers, averaging just 17.5 years old, but already hardened by combat in Russia and Italy. If anyone in the German military was qualified to assess the American paratroopers, it was von der Heydt. His observers had spotted the Pathfinder teams landing between Saint-Côme-du-Mont, Bopte, and Carentan in those early morning hours. When captured Pathfinders were brought before him around 6 in the morning, their heads shaved into mohawk patterns and their faces painted in red and white camouflage, a German captain named Trebes reportedly remarked that now they are sending us their Indians. The appearance of the American Pathfinders was startling to the Germans, who were accustomed to more conventional military presentation. Von der Heydt was less amused by the spectacle. He immediately grasped the strategic significance of what he was seeing. The deployment of elite divisions such as the Screaming Eagles was enough evidence that this mission was no localized attack, he later wrote, but that it had to be part of a larger-scale operation. The very presence of America's premier airborne division told German intelligence that this was the main invasion they had been expecting. Von der Heydt understood that the Allies would not waste their best troops on a diversion. If the 101st Airborne was here, then Normandy was the real thing. The 101st's D-Day drop was operationally chaotic in ways that initially looked like catastrophic failure. Of roughly 6,900 paratroopers who jumped in the early hours of June 6th, most landed far from their designated drop zones. Anti-aircraft fire forced pilots to take evasive action, throwing off their timing. Poor visibility made it impossible to identify landmarks. Pilot error scattered the division across a landscape of flooded marshes, hedgerows, and small villages. Entire sticks of paratroopers landed miles from where they were supposed to be. Some drowned in the flooded fields, weighed down by their equipment. Others were shot as they descended, or while struggling to free themselves from trees and power lines. By daybreak, only about 1,100 men were under divisional control. After 24 hours, this number had grown to approximately 2,500, still less than a third of the division's strength. General Maxwell Taylor, commanding the division, found himself with a fraction of the force he needed for his assigned missions. From a conventional military perspective, the drop appeared to be a disaster. But what looked like failure became an accidental weapon against the Germans. Scattered bands of paratroopers roamed behind the coastal defences in small groups of 10, 20, or 30 men. They cut telephone wires, ambushed motorcycle couriers, attacked isolated strongpoints, and created confusion about where the main landing was actually taking place. German commanders received reports of American paratroopers everywhere, which made it impossible to determine where to concentrate their reserves. German General Marx of the 84th Corps misreported paratrooper landings south of Carentan, sending precious reserves in the wrong direction at a critical moment. The chaos that should have crippled the American operation instead crippled the German response. The Germans faced an impossible problem. Their defensive doctrine assumed that enemies would attack in organized formations along predictable axes of advance. They had prepared for this, establishing strong points and reserve forces positioned to counterattack any penetration. But how do you defend against an enemy that is everywhere and nowhere, that attacks from every direction at once, that has no front line to contain? The scattered American paratroopers created the illusion of a much larger force. German commanders received reports of firefights breaking out across miles of territory and had no way to determine where the main effort was. By the time the sun rose on June 6th, the German defenders were already thoroughly confused about what they were facing. A German lieutenant named Eugen Scherer from Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6's 4th Company later described the chaotic fighting that erupted in those first hours. A gory battle developed on the disorderly grounds, he recalled, man against man and group against group. It was not possible for the battalion to have any unified leadership, as new enemy units which we had to fight kept landing in the middle of the battalion's actions. This was exactly the kind of warfare the American paratroopers had been trained for, fighting in small independent groups without central control, and exactly the kind of warfare that disrupted German command and coordination. Despite the scattered drops, the 101st accomplished its critical mission. The division was tasked with securing the causeway exits from Utah Beach, the narrow raised roads that would allow the 4th Infantry Division to move inland from the beaches. These causeways crossed flooded marshland and were the only routes off the beach for vehicles and heavy equipment. If the Germans held them, the beach invasion would stall. If the Americans took them, the landing force could push inland. Causeways 3 and 4, the northern exits, were secured by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole's men of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment by mid-morning. Cole had gathered what paratroopers he could find in the darkness and moved toward his objective, fighting through German resistance as he went. The southern exits proved more difficult. Causeway 1 at Pooperville required a 6-hour house-to-house battle against German defenders who fought stubbornly for every building. General Maxwell Taylor himself participated in the fighting there, unusual for a division commander but indicative of how desperately the Americans needed those causeways cleared. The position was not secured until approximately 11 in the morning. By early afternoon on June 6th, all 4 causeways were in American hands, a mission-critical achievement that allowed the beach assault forces to push inland. One of the most celebrated actions of that first day occurred at Brecourt Manor, a fortified German artillery position that was shelling Utah Beach. First Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, led approximately 12 men against a battery of 4 105mm howitzers. The guns belonged to the 91st Luftland Division and were defended by roughly 60 German soldiers in a fortified trench system protected by machine gun positions. Winters conducted a brief reconnaissance and devised a plan based on fire and maneuver tactics. He positioned 2 machine guns to provide suppressive fire on the German positions, then led his assault team forward. They attacked each gun position in succession, moving through the connecting trenches and clearing each emplacement before moving to the next. They destroyed all 4 guns, killed approximately 20 Germans, captured 12 prisoners, and recovered a map showing every German artillery position on the Cotentin Peninsula. This intelligence find alone was worth the entire operation, providing vital information that helped the Americans neutralize German coastal defenses. Reinforcements under Lieutenant Ronald Spears arrived to help take the 4th gun, bringing the total assault force to roughly 24 men by the end of the engagement. The action took several hours, not the few minutes depicted in some dramatizations. Winters lost only 1 man killed, Private First Class John Halls, and several wounded. The engagement is widely cited as a textbook example of small unit tactics and leadership, though claims that it is still formally taught at West Point cannot be independently verified from available sources. The most intense fighting between the 101st and German forces in Normandy came at Carentan, the critical town that linked the Utah and Omaha beachheads. Without Carentan, the 2 American beachheads would remain separated, vulnerable to being defeated in detail by German counterattacks. With Carentan, the Americans could unite their forces and begin the breakout from Normandy. Both sides understood the stakes. Von der Heiter's Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 defended the town under Rommel's orders to hold to the last man. Von der Heiter had approximately 3,500 men, themselves elite German paratroopers who had fought on multiple fronts. They prepared extensive defensive positions, flooding fields to channel attackers into kill zones, emplacing machine guns with interlocking fields of fire, and pre-registering artillery and mortar concentrations on likely approach routes. What followed was 6 days of some of the most savage fighting in the entire Normandy campaign. The approach to Carentan required advancing down a narrow exposed causeway, flanked by flooded marshes, a killing ground that soon earned the nickname Purple Heart Lane. The causeway stretched approximately 1.5 kilometers, and every metre of it was covered by German machine guns, mortars, and 88mm guns. There was no cover, no concealment, and no way to flank the German positions. The only way forward was straight through the fire. Lieutenant Colonel Robert G. Cole's 3rd Battalion of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment drew the assignment to force the causeway. Cole was a West Point graduate, a career officer, and a natural leader who led from the front. His men began their advance on June 10th, crawling forward under devastating fire. Every time they tried to rise and move, German machine guns cut them down. The battalion medics worked desperately to treat the wounded, but many could not be evacuated because the Germans fired on anyone who moved. By midnight on June 10th, Cole's battalion had suffered catastrophic casualties. Over the course of several days of fighting, roughly 2/3 of his men were killed or wounded. The survivors were exhausted, low on ammunition, and pinned down in exposed positions. Cole faced a decision that would define his career and earn him the Medal of Honor. On June 11th, with his surviving men pinned down for over an hour by withering fire and unable to advance or retreat, Cole made his choice. He ordered fixed bayonets, blew his whistle, and personally led a charge against the German positions with a pistol in one hand. It was an act of desperation that defied all military logic. Bayonet charges had been obsolete since World War I. Machine guns made them suicidal. The attack began with only about 20 men, initially following Cole forward, but others saw their commander running toward the enemy and found the courage to follow. The charge gained momentum. More men rose from their positions and joined the assault. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the German trenches. Men stabbed and clubbed and shot at point-blank range. Of Cole's approximately 265 remaining men, roughly 130 became casualties in this single action, but the Germans were driven from their positions. Cole's charge was one of the few American bayonet attacks of World War II, a throwback to an earlier era of warfare. Claims that it was the last bayonet charge of consequence in American military history are incorrect, as Captain Lewis Millett would lead a bayonet charge up Hill 180 near Soamni, Korea in February 1951 and receive the Medal of Honor for that action. But Cole's charge at Carentan was extraordinary nonetheless, a desperate gamble that succeeded against all odds. Von der Heydte documented the endgame at Carentan in his reports. At approximately 5 in the afternoon on June 11th, he reported that all leaders of Jager companies have fallen or been wounded. Hardest fighting on the city limits of Carentan. The last of the ammunition has been fired. His elite Fallschirmjäger regiment, itself among the Wehrmacht's best units, had been ground down until it could no longer fight effectively. Every company commander was dead or wounded. The ammunition was exhausted. There was nothing left to fight with. Von der Heydte ordered his surviving troops to abandon Carentan overnight, withdrawing to positions further south. His regiment had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force, at least temporarily. The unit that had once been one of the Wehrmacht's finest was reduced to scattered survivors desperately trying to regroup. But the Germans were not finished with Carentan. On June 13th, just 2 days after the Americans took the town, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Gotz von Berlichingen counterattacked with assault guns, tanks, and fresh infantry. The German assault struck the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which was holding positions south of the town. The weight of the attack drove the paratroopers back nearly to the town's outskirts in what became known as the Battle of Bloody Gulch. Easy Company under Lieutenant Winters held an exposed position along a railroad embankment without armour support. German tanks and infantry pressed forward, and the paratroopers had nothing heavier than bazookas to stop them. The situation was desperate. If the Germans broke through, they would retake Carentan and split the American beachhead. The situation was saved when tanks from Combat Command A of the 2nd Armoured Division arrived and shattered the German assault. The exact number of tanks varies in different accounts, but the armoured counterattack caught the Germans in the open and inflicted severe casualties. The 17th SS was badly mauled in the engagement and withdrew. Carentan remained in American hands. The total Normandy campaign cost the 101st approximately 4,670 casualties over roughly 36 days, including 546 killed, over 2,200 wounded, and over 1,900 missing. These figures are often confused with those of the 82nd Airborne Division, which suffered different losses. Robert Cole would be recommended for the Medal of Honor for his bayonet charge, but he would not live to receive it. The 101st fought continuously until mid-July, when it was withdrawn to England for rest and rebuilding. In September 1944, the 101st jumped into Holland as part of Operation Market Garden, the ambitious plan to seize bridges across the major Dutch rivers and open a corridor for British armoured forces to advance into Germany. The plan was the brainchild of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and was intended to end the war by Christmas 1944. It would prove to be one of the most controversial operations of the war. The division was assigned the southernmost sector of the airborne carpet, approximately 16 miles of road between Eindhoven and Veghel, that British 30th Corps needed for its armoured advance north. This single highway, running through flat open terrain, became known as Hell's Highway. Holding it meant the 101st was stretched dangerously thin, responsible for dozens of bridges and crossroads along 16 miles of road with no reserves and no room for error. Unlike Normandy's chaotic night drops, Market Garden was a daylight operation with far more accurate landings. The men could see where they were going, and the pilots could identify the drop zones. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment captured all 4 bridges at Veghel within hours of landing, securing a critical section of the corridor. The 506th raced toward the Sun Bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal, but a German Kampfgruppe from the Hermann Göring Training Regiment held long enough for the Germans to demolish the bridge as the paratroopers approached. The explosion sent a plume of smoke into the sky and caused a delay that rippled through the entire operation. Engineers would have to build a replacement bridge, costing precious hours. At best, the fighting grew desperate. The town controlled a secondary bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal, and the Germans were determined to hold it. Lieutenant Colonel Cole, the hero of Purple Heart Lane who had survived Normandy and earned the Medal of Honor for his bayonet charge, was killed by a sniper on September 18th while placing identification panels for air support. He was looking up at an approaching aircraft when the bullet struck him in the head. He died instantly, never knowing that he had been approved for the Medal of Honor. That same day, Private First Class Joe Mann of the 502nd demonstrated the kind of sacrifice that defined the division. Mann had already been wounded 4 times in the fighting at best. Both his arms were bandaged and essentially useless. When a German grenade landed in his foxhole, he had no way to throw it back. Instead, he shouted a warning to his comrades and threw himself onto the grenade, absorbing the blast with his body. He died, saving his squad. Mann received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The division's 2 Medal of Honor recipients in the entire war died within 24 hours of each other at best, a sobering indication of the intensity of the fighting there. The Germans repeatedly tried to sever Hell's Highway and cut off the Allied advance. On September 22nd, simultaneous attacks from east and west struck at Veghel, threatening to cut the road and trap the British forces to the north. Panzer Brigade 107 with Panther tanks attacked from one direction, while Kampfgruppe Huber with Jagdpanthers struck from the other. The attacks were coordinated to catch the Americans in a vice. The 101st bent but held. 2 battalions of the 501st engaged Kampfgruppe Huber from the rear in a surprise attack that caught the Germans off guard. The American paratroopers virtually annihilated the German unit according to after-action reports, destroying vehicles and scattering survivors. On September 24th, von der Heydt's Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6, the same unit that had fought the division at Carentan and been ground down to a shadow of its former strength, attacked through Eerde toward Veghel. The fighting continued until September 25th, by which time Market Garden had effectively failed at Arnhem, where British paratroopers had been overwhelmed. The 101st spent a total of 72 days in continuous combat in Holland, from September 17th through November 27th, 1944. During Market Garden itself, the division suffered 2,110 casualties. The subsequent defensive operations on the island, the low ground between the Waal and Lower Rhine rivers where the division held positions under constant German harassment, cost an additional 1,682 casualties. The division was finally withdrawn to Camp Mourmelon in France for rest in late November. They would rest for exactly 3 weeks. On December 16, 1944, the Wehrmacht launched its Ardennes offensive, the last major German attack of the war. The assault was intended to split the Allied forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The offensive included over 400,000 troops, approximately 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and over 2,600 artillery pieces. It achieved complete surprise, hitting thinly held American lines in the forested Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. Bastogne, a crossroads town where 7 major roads converged in the Belgian Ardennes, was critical to the German advance. The Germans needed those roads to supply their offensive and move their forces. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the road network. If the Americans held the town, the German advance would be channelized into narrow routes where it could be contained. If the Germans took Bastogne, they could fan out across the Belgian countryside. The 101st, still under strength from Holland and lacking cold weather gear, was loaded onto open-air trucks on December 18th and driven 107 miles through sleet and darkness toward the threatened town. The soldiers had been resting and refitting, expecting to spend Christmas in relative comfort. Instead, they found themselves hurtling through the night toward the sound of guns, still wearing the same uniforms they had worn in the autumn fighting. Major General Maxwell Taylor was in Washington at the time, conferring with military officials about airborne operations. He would not return to the division until after the siege was broken. Command fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division's artillery commander. McAuliffe was not an infantryman by training, but he was a competent and tough-minded officer who would prove more than equal to the crisis. The division arrived at Bastogne on December 19th, just hours ahead of the leading German forces. The margin was razor-thin. German reconnaissance elements were already probing the approaches to the town. If the 101st had arrived even a few hours later, they would have had to fight their way into Bastogne rather than establishing defensive positions before the Germans arrived. The timing proved decisive. What the Germans threw at Bastogne was overwhelming. General Heinrich von Luttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps included the 2nd Panzer Division, one of the Wehrmacht's premier armoured formations. It included Panzer Lehr Division under Fritz Bayerlein, a veteran tank commander who had served under Rommel in North Africa. It included the 26th Volksgrenadier Division under Heinz Kokott, a full-strength infantry division that had been rebuilt specifically for this offensive. These forces were later reinforced by the 15th Panzergrenadier Division and elements of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division. Estimates of German strength around Bastogne range from 30,000 to 50,000 troops, surrounding roughly 18,000 Americans. The defenders included not just the 101st, but also elements of Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division, which had arrived before the encirclement closed. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion provided anti-tank capability. Various engineer and artillery units that had been swept up in the German advance were gathered into the perimeter. It was a hodgepodge force that somehow had to hold against multiple German divisions. The defence of Nouville on the northern approaches illustrated what the Germans were up against. Major William de Sobry's task force of approximately 400 men from the 10th Armoured Division was reinforced by the 1st Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Together they held off the entire 2nd Panzer Division for 2 critical days. The German division had 85 tanks, including Panzer IV medium tanks and Panther heavy tanks, plus 48 Stug 3 assault guns, a total of 133 armoured fighting vehicles. Against this armoured might, de Sobry's men had only a handful of Shermans and some tank destroyers. The fighting at Nouville was brutal. German tanks attacked through the morning fog, and American tank destroyers picked them off at close range. Infantry from both sides fought in the streets of the village. The Americans destroyed at least 30 German tanks and inflicted between 500 and 1,000 casualties on the 2nd Panzer Division. The delay at Nouville was critical. The 2nd Panzer Division was supposed to bypass Bastogne and drive for the Meuse River crossings. Instead, it spent 2 days battering itself against a tiny blocking force. By the time the Germans broke through, they had lost irreplaceable tanks and precious time. The 1st Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment lost 13 officers and 199 enlisted men at Nouville, roughly 35% of its strength. When they finally withdrew on December 20th, they brought their wounded with them, refusing to leave anyone behind. The delay at Nouville ultimately contributed to the 2nd Panzer Division running out of fuel at Selles on Christmas Day, where it was destroyed by American counterattacks. The sacrifice at Nouville helped doom the entire German offensive. Meanwhile, Panzerlehr's byline was delayed by a combination of confusion and aggressive American action. Lieutenant Colonel Julian Ewell of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment attacked German forces at Neff on December 19th in a spoiling attack that caught the Germans off guard. A Belgian civilian in Magaret had misinformed Bayerlein about a powerful American armoured column in the area. Bayerlein, cautious by nature and aware that his intelligence was spotty, wasted precious hours preparing to attack a force that did not exist in the strength he feared. These delays bought Bastogne time to organise its defences. By December 22nd, the encirclement was complete. No supplies could get in, no wounded could get out. The weather had turned bitterly cold, with temperatures dropping well below freezing and snow covering the ground. The overcast skies prevented air resupply or close air support, leaving the defenders entirely on their own. Artillery ammunition was restricted to 10 rounds per gun per day because the gunners had to conserve what little they had. Medical supplies were critically short, and the aid stations were filling with wounded who could not be evacuated. Surgeons operated by flashlight in freezing cellars, doing what they could with dwindling supplies of anesthesia and antibiotics. Food was running low. Many soldiers had not eaten a hot meal in days. They huddled in frozen foxholes, wrapped in whatever they could find, trying to stay warm enough to fight. Frostbite began claiming casualties, men whose feet turned black from the cold. The situation was grim by any measure, yet morale remained remarkably high. The paratroopers had been trained for exactly this situation. Being surrounded and undersupplied was not new to them. It was what they had expected all along. At approximately 11:30 in the morning on December 22nd, 4 German soldiers approached American lines under white flags. The senior officer was a Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps. The junior officer, Lieutenant Helmuth Henke of Panzerlehr's Operations Section, carried a briefcase containing a typed surrender demand. The German party was blindfolded and led to the American lines, where they delivered their message. The message was addressed to the American commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. "The fortune of war is changing," it read. "This time, the American forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armoured units. More German armoured units have crossed the river Orth near Orthoville, have taken Marche and reached Saint-Hubert. Liebremont is in German hands. There is only one possibility to save the encircled troops from total annihilation, that is the honourable surrender of the encircled town." The message threatened destruction by 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions if the Americans did not comply within 2 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore woke mcauliffe with the news. "The Germans have sent some people forward to take our surrender," Moore told him. mcauliffe, still groggy from sleep, muttered nuts and climbed out of his sleeping bag. He thought at first that the Germans wanted to surrender to him, and when Moore explained that it was the other way around, mcauliffe found the suggestion absurd. His men were giving the Germans hell, he thought, not the other way around. When his staff gathered to draft a formal reply, they struggled to find appropriate language. The situation called for something formal, something military, but no one could think of anything that captured their contempt for the German demand. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer, suggested that what mcauliffe had said initially would be hard to beat. The general agreed and had his one-word response typed on a single sheet. To the German commander, Nuts, the American commander, Colonel Joseph Harper, commander of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, volunteered to deliver the reply personally. He found the German officers still waiting blindfolded where they had been left. When Lieutenant Henke read the message and asked if the reply was negative or affirmative, Harper replied that the reply is decidedly not affirmative. He added for emphasis that if you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city. At the perimeter, Private First Class Ernest Premetz translated for the confused Germans. "Du kannst zum Teufel gehen," he said. "You can go to hell." The German officers were escorted back to their lines. The 2-hour deadline passed. The threatened artillery barrage never materialized because, as the Americans did not know, most of the German heavy guns had already been moved past Bastogne and were out of range of the town. The reaction at German higher headquarters was telling. Bayerlein wanted to unleash whatever artillery was available on the town, but von Lüttwitz informed him that the guns were gone. Von Manteuffel, commanding the entire 5th Panzer Army, later stated that he never authorized the surrender demand. Von Lüttwitz had issued it on his own initiative, apparently believing that the Americans would capitulate when confronted with their hopeless situation. Von Manteuffel added that the American refusal was as was to be expected, perhaps the highest compliment a German general could pay. It was an acknowledgement that elite airborne troops would never surrender, even when surrounded and outgunned. Von Manteuffel had known before the demand was delivered that it would be refused. Instead of artillery, the Luftwaffe launched 4 nights of bombing starting Christmas Eve. German aircraft dropped bombs on the town, destroying buildings and killing soldiers and civilians alike. But the Americans held their positions and continued to fight. Hitler demanded that Bastogne be taken on Christmas Day. The town had become an embarrassment to the German High Command, a defiant pocket of resistance in the middle of what was supposed to be a triumphant offensive. Cocotte planned a 2-pronged assault on the western perimeter with 18 Mark IV tanks carrying a battalion of infantry from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, supported by the 77th Volksgrenadier Regiment. The attack was carefully planned to strike where the American defenses appeared weakest. The assault struck at approximately 5:30 in the morning on December 25th, piercing the lines of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment and driving as far as the battalion command post at Hemrul. German tanks rolled through the pre-dawn darkness, their engines growling and their guns firing. For a brief moment, it appeared the Germans might break through. It was a catastrophe for the attackers. The German tanks split into 2 columns, one heading for Champs and the other for Hemrul. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment and tank destroyers of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion caught the Champs column in a devastating crossfire. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, a unit that had essentially volunteered itself into the battle when its parent division was destroyed, fired point-blank at German tanks approaching Hemrul. The artillerymen had positioned their howitzers to fire directly at approaching armour, and they did so with deadly effect. Every one of the 18 German tanks was destroyed. Not a single tank that began the assault survived the day. The supporting infantry was cut down or scattered. The 327th held its original positions and captured prisoners from the shattered German assault force. Cocotte's post-war account revealed that he did not anticipate much resistance on the western perimeter because most previous attacks had come from the south and east. He had assumed the western sector was lightly held. He was catastrophically wrong. The weather finally cleared on December 23rd, allowing air resupply. C-47 transport aircraft braved German anti-aircraft fire to drop supplies under parachutes of red, yellow and blue. The coloured parachutes drifted down over the besieged town, carrying ammunition, food and medical supplies. P-47 fighter bombers began hammering German positions around the perimeter, strafing convoys and bombing assembly areas. The tide was beginning to turn. On December 26th, at approximately 4:50 in the afternoon, the spearhead of Patton's 4th Armoured Division broke through to Bastogne from the south. Patton had turned his entire 3rd Army 90 degrees in one of the most remarkable manoeuvres of the war, driving north through winter weather to relieve the besieged town. First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, driving the M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman named Cobra King, made first contact with the 326th Airborne Engineers' positions on the southern perimeter. At approximately 5:10 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams shook hands with McAuliffe. The siege was broken, but the fighting was far from over. Fierce combat continued for weeks as the Americans and Germans struggled for control of the roads around Bastogne. The 101st was not relieved until January 18, 1945, a full month after the siege began. The Bastogne defence cost the 101st heavily. Through January 6th, the division suffered 482 killed, 2,449 wounded, and 527 missing. German losses were far heavier. Kokot's 26th Volksgrenadier Division alone lost several hundred men in single attacks, with particularly high officer casualties. The division took 981 German prisoners at Bastogne. The German fear of the 101st Airborne was not the product of American propaganda, but of repeated painful experience across 3 campaigns. At Carentan, von der Heydt's elite Fallschirmjäger, themselves among the Wehrmacht's best soldiers, were ground down until their ammunition was exhausted and every company commander was dead or wounded. They had faced an enemy that would not stop coming, that absorbed casualties that would have broken other units, and that attacked even when defense would have been the rational choice. At Bastogne, Kokot threw division after division against a perimeter held by freezing, undersupplied paratroopers, and watched his attacks shattered every time. Bayerlein was deceived into wasting precious hours. Von Manteuffel acknowledged that demanding surrender from the 101st was pointless before the demand was even delivered. The pattern was consistent across every major engagement. The Screaming Eagles could not be broken by conventional tactics. What made these paratroopers so formidable was rooted in their selection and training. Every man had volunteered not once but repeatedly. Every man had survived training, designed to eliminate anyone who was not exceptional. This self-selection produced soldiers with a fundamentally different mentality from conscripts or even regular volunteers. They expected to be surrounded. They expected to be outgunned. They expected to fight alone without support. And when those conditions materialized, they simply did what they had been trained to do. The division's willingness to absorb catastrophic casualties without losing cohesion or offensive spirit made it an opponent that could not be worn down by attrition. At Purple Heart Lane, Cole's battalion suffered roughly 2/3 casualties and kept attacking. At Nouville, the 1st Battalion of the 506th lost 35% of its strength in 2 days and maintained its defensive positions. At Bastogne, the division held for over a week while surrounded, outgunned, undersupplied and freezing, and never wavered. No amount of casualties seemed to break them. The 101st Airborne fought 214 days of combat in the European theatre of operations, suffering 9,328 battle casualties, including 2,155 killed. These figures come from official army records and represent a casualty rate that was extraordinary even by World War II standards. The division received the first Distinguished Unit Citation, later renamed the Presidential Unit Citation, ever awarded to an entire division, for its defense of Bastogne. General Eisenhower himself presented the award in March 1945. Von Manteuffel's quiet acknowledgement that McAuliffe's refusal was to be expected is perhaps the most telling German verdict on the 101st Airborne Division. By December 1944, the Wehrmacht's senior commanders understood that the Screaming Eagles would fight to destruction rather than yield. That understanding, confirmed by every engagement from Normandy to Holland to the Ardennes, is the definition of a unit that is genuinely feared. The legacy of the 101st Airborne in World War II extends beyond the statistics of battles won and casualties suffered. The division demonstrated what was possible when extraordinary selection and training were combined with a doctrinal approach perfectly suited to the chaos of modern combat. The Germans had faced elite units before. They had faced determined resistance before, but they had never faced anything quite like the Screaming Eagles, a division that seemed to thrive on the very conditions that would have broken other units. The German hatred of the 101st was not born of propaganda or prejudice. It was born of painful experience, of watching attack after attack fail against men who should have been overwhelmed, of seeing carefully planned offensives stall because a handful of paratroopers refused to retreat, and of learning again and again that encirclement and numerical superiority meant nothing against soldiers who had been trained to fight surrounded and outnumbered. The 101st Airborne earned the fear of the German army, the only way such fear can truly be earned, by defeating them repeatedly in battle and refusing to break no matter what they faced. When the war ended, the division had written a record that would stand as one of the most remarkable in American military history. The rendezvous with destiny that General Lee had promised had been kept, not once but across 3 brutal campaigns. The Germans who had fought against them, from von der Heydt's elite Fallschirmjäger at Carentan to Kokot's Volksgrenadiers at Bastogne, knew better than anyone what that record had cost and what it meant. They had been among the best soldiers the Wehrmacht could field, and they had not been enough to break the screaming eagles.